research, partners for university-led solutions engine. In short form, we have referred to it for all the years as Laser Pulse, and it is a $70 million program funded through USAID's Innovation, Technology and Research Hub. And we are largely, as a consortium, working to deliver research-driven solutions to field source development challenges, specifically in USAID partner countries. So the consortium has different partners, and it's under the leadership of Purdue University in the United States of America. But we also closely work with the Catholic Relief Services, Indiana University, of course, Makerere University, the University of Notre Dame, are the key partners within the Laser Pulse Consortium. And we are proud to grow up to a network of 3,400 plus researchers, and these are multidisciplinary researchers and development practitioners in about 74 countries. To date, as a consortium, we have continued to collaborate with USAID missions in the different countries, but also bureaus and independent offices, including local stakeholders who play a key role in the work that we are doing, largely to identify research needs for critical development challenges, but also to offer funding and strengthen capacity of researcher practitioner teams, specifically to co-design solutions that translate into different practices, but also policies. We've shared our web contact in there, and you will be able to read details about the Laser Pulse Consortium. Yeah, so back to the toolkit that has brought us together. We have an objective why we put together the toolkit, and it is on capacity strengthening on USAID's requirements in respect to pre-award procedures, specifically on compliance to environmental requirements, and number 2, on integration of gender considerations in protocols and applications, and then lastly, finance and administrative engagement. So these are the 3 areas the toolkit covers, and we are going to have a quick highlight and in-depth discussion thereafter around the 3 areas within the toolkit. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take this opportunity to introduce to you our speakers for the morning and afternoon, depending on where we are logged on from. It's a pleasure to introduce 3 distinguished ladies. One of them is Dr. Betty Bogusu. Dr. Bogusu is a project management professional with 18 plus years of experience leading complex international development projects in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, South America, and the United States. Currently, she is the technical director for Laser Pulse, which is a USAID-funded program, like I shared earlier, led by Purdue University. She provides technical oversight to Laser Pulse research awards in various USAID focus areas. You will allow me to paste Dr. Betty Bogusu's additional profile in the chat room for our reference purposes, but you might have also read it upon registration to join this engagement. The other lady who is with us is Dr. Ruth Nsibirano, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Women and Gender Studies here at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. Dr. Nsibirano has served in several capacities in the university. She has over 12 years experience in the teaching of women and gender, and she is a competent gender trainer, a gender analyst, and a researcher. In the same vein, we will share her profile in the chat room. Ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker will be Susie Sear. who is the Assistant Director of Awards Management for Purdue Applied Research Institute's Global Development and Innovation Division. She has more than 15 years of experience in financial management in higher education institutions. Most recently, Susie served as the International Sponsored Programs Manager for the Laser Pulse Consortium. We will paste the details in the chat room as we go on with the engagement. Without further ado, allow me to request Dr. Betty Boguso to kindly unmute and take us through the compliance to environmental requirements within the toolkit. Over to you, Dr. Boguso. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Harriet, for that introduction and for providing the objectives of this engagement. So I'm gonna talk about compliance to environmental requirement, but full disclosure, I'm not an environmental expert, but the knowledge that I'm going to share with you is what I've learned in the course of implementing USAID projects. So next slide, please. So why is environmental compliance important? It's important because it's mandatory for all USAID projects to be able to comply with the requirements for the environment. And this involves assessing risk that could cause environmental or community issues to the areas that, to the projects that are supported by USAID. This mandate comes through the Federal Code of Federal Register 216/22, and it's linked there for those of you who are interested in reading more about it, but it provides a systematic examination and mitigation of environmental impacts. And this requirement is generally a responsibility for USAID staff. And the USAID staff essentially are required to utilize this Code of Federal Regulations during the program design or activity design or in the solicitation stage. As we mentioned, we are currently working on the pre-award processes. Likewise, USAID awardees, or like anyone who receives USAID funding, is required to comply with any environmental rules and regulations that are provided in this Code Federal Register 216. Next slide. So this process, it involves environmental impact assessment. And this is the process that it's used to identify positive and negative impacts that the activities being conducted may have on the environment. And so it aims to monitor and mitigate those effects in one way or another, but making sure that no impact is caused on the environment where the activities are being conducted. It involves screening for both foreseeable and unforeseeable environmental implications. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the preceding slides. So in this presentation, I will talk about two stages. First is the pre-award stage, which is the most important stage that we would like to highlight for this, but I'll touch slightly on the post-award stage that involves activities that may have been identified to have some potential impact on the environment. So for the pre-award process, we have two forms that are required to be filled. The first one is request for categorical exclusion, otherwise known as RCE. Again, that's a hyperlink. You can easily click on it and see how the form looks like. The second one is initial environmental examination. And this comes after they have determined in the RCE that your activities have some particular effects on the environment or in the community where you are working. The other two forms are called Environmental Mitigation and Monitoring Plan, or EMMP. This is the one that you now design specific activities to address those implications or environmental issues that have been identified. And again, all these are standard forms that are provided by USAID. And the last one is Environmental Mitigation and Monitoring Report, which is EMMR. And this report is required to be given every reporting period. As most of you have worked with USAID, know we have two reporting periods for the semi-annual report and the annual report, covering 6 months of project implementation. We have also provided a link to where all these forms are housed on the USAID website. for anyone who might be interested to go and dig deeper into those, because we'll just cover in a cursory way here today. Next slide. So this is how the process flow goes. This schematic shows you where you start from, as I said, with the RCE, request for categorical exclusion. And once that categorical exclusion has been reviewed and determined that your activities do not have any impact on the environment, there is no further action on the part of the researcher or the person on the part of the person who applied for the award. However, if your activities are determined to have some negative implications, sometimes with conditions or not, then you have to move to the next step. And that next step is the IEE, Initial Environmental Examination. With that step, you specifically include the specific activities. As you know, when you implement a project, you have several activities. Some activities may have environmental implications, some may not have. So for the IEE, you only select those activities that have environmental implications. And with those, you start to develop what are those implications. You determine what are some of the mitigations you'll have to apply to avoid those or to mitigate those kinds of issues. And once you have done that, you'll submit it again to USAID. And USAID will review and give you feedback based on the activities that have been identified to have environmental impact. And with that, once they have approved those activities, you now move to the next step, which is the EMMP. This is where you design a monitoring and mitigation plan. And with this involves what are those activities you'll put in place to reduce those impacts on the environment. Finally, this EMMP is supposed to be approved by USAID Environment Office. And once it's been approved, now you are ready to go to start with your project. And in particular, those activities that had effects. And with that, following every 6 months reporting period, you'll be giving a report of how you've mitigated those effects, those environmental issues that were identified in your project. Next slide. So let me dig a little bit deeper into each one of these forms, just to give you a flavor of what it takes to fill out the forms. First of all, the request for categorical exclusion, RCE, is required by each and every project that is submitted to USAID for funding. And therefore, it's reviewed by the Environment Office, and the feedback is provided based on the schematic that I just highlighted previously. Typically, an RCE will be approved for a project or for a specific activity within a project that may have effects on the environment. So if your project is determined that all activities are good, they don't have any environmental effect, that's when I said you don't have to do anything else. Okay, and then once they determine that there are some issues, again, it will trigger you to go forth to the next step, which is the IEE. So which projects are eligible for categorical exclusion? And again, these are mostly low-risk projects. Number one is if it has no effect on the natural or physical environment, then it will go through. Other activities that may not have a significant impact on the environment may also go through. And I also mentioned previously that if this activity, you may have a whole project, but just certain activities have effects, then again, those are the ones that will be identified. So I've just provided again the Code of Federal Regulation in this link, again for your reference as we go deeper into these forms. Next slide. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next form, which is the Initial Environmental Examination. Again, this is required for all activities that have been determined to have a significant effect on the environment or sometimes in the communities where you are working. Its purpose is to provide a preliminary review of reasonable foreseeable effects to the environment. And those then you make determinations for recommendations to mitigate them. So the document has, will have those specific activities with categorical exclusions. And then it will also provide a factual basis for a threshold decision as to whether the environment assessment is required or not. So it's also in this document where you'll be required to highlight some of the risk management activities, climate risk management activities. Again, the form comes with all this information and it walks you through step by step how to apply or how to implement or how to fill it out. And the CRM or the climate risk management process involves aspects that are under the USAID policy, ADS 201. Next slide. So what is the threshold for a decision on whether to go forward with an IEE? So these are things that have positive determination, and I'm not gonna read through everything here, but I just want to highlight some things that specifically you may pay attention to. So if it's an activity is likely to have significant impact, then it's a positive determination. And with that, you have to proceed to an IEE. Similarly, negative determinations, whereby the activity has no significant adverse effects, but has some potential implications on the environment, you also have to move forward with the IEE. No, you don't have to move forward with the IEE. However, if you have negative conditions, negative determinations with conditions, in other words, conditions that need to be met for it to have no implications on environment, then you have to move forward to the IEE. And finally is the deferral, whereby there isn't not enough information to make a determination at that stage in time. So USAID will defer to wait until you have enough information. So you may start your project at this stage, and once you have enough information to determine whether there's an environmental impact, then you'll move forward to an IEE. Next slide. So these are examples of projects that might require an IEE, this is where the rubber meets the road, to see exactly what are those kinds of projects. Again, I won't read all the program that works in river basin management, or if you are using agriculture land leveling, anywhere where you are applying any form of disruption to the agricultural land, you may be required to do an IEE. Also, issues like road construction, resettlement projects where there's some sort of construction will definitely require an IEE. Next slide. The third step here after you've done an IEE is to determine a mitigation and monitoring plan, EMMP. And the EMMP is always prepared after USAID has approved the IEE for the activities you identify to have the impact. The EMMP addresses mostly the negative determinations with conditions which were identified in the IEE in the previous step. And the EMMP is used by the project design team in a way that you are able to document these are the mitigation processes you'll put in place, and that you have to follow them as you implement your project. You also provide specific monitoring actions to make sure that nothing goes off track based on the activities you are conducting. And finally, the EMMP measures actions that should be, the EMMP actions should be very specific. In other words, you have to state specifically what you are going to do to mitigate the issue. And somebody has to be able, if somebody or if an environment officer is visiting your project, they have to be verifiable. So the EMMP is generally prepared by the awardee. So, and USAID provides guidelines once you have identified those activities and determined what are the plans you are putting in place. Next slide. Lastly is the environmental mitigation and monitoring report. As I've already gone over this is a report that you give every 6 months or every reporting period for the federally funded projects. And this, again, you go through the whole process, you identify the activity, you see the monitoring and mitigation processes you've put in place, and you report what you have done based on what you had identified as your mitigation strategy. Next slide. This is an example of an EMMR. This is the only one we were able to provide an example. However, there are several examples even on our Laser Pulse website that you can visit and review. And this one gives, it's an EMMR for post-harvest agricultural production activity. And with this, I know the font is too small for you to see, but just to note that this is a kind of form that you'll be filling every 6 months once it has been determined that your activity or your set of projects, your set of activities have some environmental community impact. Next slide. So a few environmental considerations that you need to put in place just to understand that these are the ones that will likely trigger an IEE. These are like pesticide procedures. So for agricultural projects that require use of pesticides or fertilizers or those kinds of things likely will not qualify for an exemption. So if you are making such a proposition, you have to keep in mind that you will likely not get the exclusion and have to start thinking of what the mitigation strategies will be. And again, these are mandated by the United States EPA in the, as part of the registration of your project. Also, on the basis of the selection of the requested pesticide, you may have to determine especially how much quantity you are utilizing and be able to give an account of how the pesticides will be applied and that kind of thing. Also, the proposed method of application is very important. If you are spraying them or if you are just dropping them into the soil, that will also determine what kind of procedures you put in place for the mitigation. Finally, any acute and long-term toxicological data has to be provided so that anyone who comes in contact with these pesticides knows exactly what kind of hazards they are facing and what kind of protection they need as they apply or use these pesticides and chemicals. Then the compatibility of those in the compatibility of the pesticides in the target ecosystem. So I won't go through the whole detail, but you have this PowerPoint slide, you can reference it. And if you have any questions, you can also feel free to put in the chat box. Next slide. A few other environmental considerations to put in mind. Some awards are excluded from the environment assessment. And we would like to provide examples of these ones. For example, if you are doing a project on international disaster assistance or in emergencies, say a hurricane or a war, you may not be required to do these kinds of forms simply because the situation doesn't call for that. You don't have time to assess the environment impact. Other examples are circumstances involving exception of foreign policy sensitivities. And these are where you have to be sensitive to what's going on in the particular country or within the government where you are working. If there are certain sensitivities, you may not be required to go through the whole environmental process. Otherwise, generally for all projects, it's a specific requirement. Next slide. So just a few key takeaways for you all is that compliance with the environment is obliged for all awardees and must start at the beginning of the project. When you are designing your project, you have to keep that in mind. And as I said, submit the RCE. And then on a regular basis, the project team should be checking in to see if anything within the project has changed that might trigger an environmental issue that requires mitigation. And this has to be done on a regular basis. As we said, semi-annual reports is one way to pinpoint some of these areas where this environmental monitoring may be triggered. And with that, I'll hand it over to the next presenter, Ruth, who is gonna be talking on gender considerations. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Betty. Ruth, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I'm able to.
Please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty, and thank you so much, Harriet. Members that have joined us on this call, I welcome you, and a good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. This moment, I'm going to take you through the requirement to integrate gender considerations in your applications. Next slide. We are going to be looking at mainly understanding a few of the very critical concepts that you will come across. Of course, the pool is big, rich, but we'll look at a few of them. And I'll start with the concept of gender. Gender is a social construction that helps us to understand how we relate, the relationships between males and females, the relationships among females and males, and how this is influenced by the different economic and political attributes that each one of us holds. Sometimes we have economic variations in those between those that have more and those that have less, and these inform the different power structures that we have that influence how we relate. And gender also is a term that has an attribute of dynamism. It is not fixed, and that gives us an advantage of trying to address gender inequalities, because it's not fixed that what I have or do not have must remain the way it is. It is important for us as researchers to understand that any negative attributes arising from the gender construction in the areas that we are operating from should be addressed and can successfully be addressed to ensure that we all enjoy, as beneficiaries of the research, as beneficiaries of any innovations arising from science, be able to enjoy the same opportunities, the same privileges, regardless of our sex, regardless of our age, and regardless of where we are at in terms of the geographical space. So it is important to understand gender, because USAID holds it as very key in programs that are funded by funds from USAID. And the reason that this is done is so as to promote gender equality. Therefore, in addition to gender, another term or concept that I want to share with you is gender analysis. This is a strategy that enables researchers, scholars to understand where the differences are and where the disadvantages, challenges, or factors that disadvantage different people in sharing opportunities, in accessing opportunities are. And from the gender analysis, then the next concept comes in, please, next slide, is the gender integration. Gender integration is nothing other than having the potential and the capacity to try and integrate the gender issues that you have identified to ensure that we have inclusivity. Inclusivity is also another concept, to ensure that we have gender equity, gender equality, so that even the benefits that accrue from the different innovations, the different projects that you are proposing to implement will trickle down to the last person, regardless of what their gender or their social position in society are. Therefore, gender integration is really the in thing, and we need it because men and women are variedly positioned in society, and they play different roles. And therefore, because they play different roles, their requirements, their priorities keep varying. And therefore, for us to talk of inclusive development, for us to be able to talk about and also contribute to sustainable development, we cannot forget the need to integrate gender. Therefore, it becomes very relevant that we understand why we need to integrate gender and also how we are going to do it. So I'll take you to the next slide, which is also going to tell us how we should integrate gender. First and foremost, we need to be able to conduct a gender analysis. And this is a very important tool. There are a number of frameworks that can be used to enable researchers and scholars conduct a gender analysis. It's very good discipline to start with a gender analysis so that we have the background of who is doing what in the areas that we are choosing to have our research conducted or projects implemented, who has what, who doesn't have resources, what are the factors that are explaining why they do not have access to resources, what are the factors that are going to help us understand why possibly they are not reached by the different initiatives that are on the ground. And therefore, in this presentation, I'm underlining the fact that the gender analysis should be a tool that you hold very close to your implementation. You start with it. You can also use it mid-term as you are implementing to ensure that with your research or with your innovation or with your project that you are implementing, you are not adding to the existing challenge, the burden of inequality and limited access to opportunities and limited reach of the benefits. But with your project, with your research, you are addressing the inequalities and the negative impact that comes with not integrating gender. As researchers, how do you do this? It starts right at the proposal level. When you are crafting that research question, what is the focus of your research? What is the focus of your innovation? What is the focus of the strategy that you are intending to put in place? Does it address the different needs and priorities of the supposed beneficiaries that you want to reach out to? So meaning that your focus must have at the back of your mind a need to be equitable, a need to include, a need to touch the lives of the men and women, boys and girls in the communities that you are going to be operating in. Can you please tell me to the next slide? If we do not do that, then we will not be able to have opportunities spread out. If we do not have a gender analysis and integrate it, then we will not have an opportunity to contribute to successful ideas that our funders are aiming at. And to do that, to guide the researchers into this, USAID has been kind enough to give us a checklist. And this checklist has 4 dimensions that you shared here. One is access to assets and resources. Resources are very important when we are talking about development, contributing to development. So when we conduct our gender analysis and when we write our projects and as we implement our projects, we need always to have an eye on whether the supposed beneficiaries of our innovations and research are having access to the resources, are having access to assets, resources like land, resources like financial funds. And if not, then we need to take deliberate efforts to have in-place strategies that will ensure that those that are missing out on access to resources and assets can have them in place. The other area that you need to have an eye on is the knowledge. In places that you are going to be working in, what are the knowledge sets that are available? What are the cultural norms and beliefs and perceptions? These are very important for us to understand because they are going to influence the success of the implementation of whatever it is that we are doing. For example, if people have a negative perception about the innovation or the technology that you are sharing or you're rolling out, then unless the perception is addressed, then uptake is going to be affected. The norms, the cultural norms, there are some areas, some communities, some societies where you will find norms spelling out how interactions and relationships have to be held. So if the norm is against males and females relating, males and females moving together or sitting together in the same setting, in the same space for a discussion, and the researcher doesn't know about this, then the implementation or the dissemination that is planned to take place in the same setting is going to be unsuccessful, because even when the invitations are widely sent out, but because of the norms that segregate, that limit mobility, that affect mixing, are going to result into one gender missing out. So it is important, because then it is going to guide how we conduct our practices. Gender roles is another dimension that should be very close to your eye. What are the roles that men and women are engaged in? What are the expectations for the different genders in terms of roles? What responsibilities? And therefore, that is also going to have implications on time and space. When you're going to conduct or roll out your innovations or have sensitization workshops, what time should you plan them to be running? That should be conscious of the fact that men and women will be undertaking different gender roles, and possibly they will not have time to engage. We have seen campaigns for political leadership. You want to promote women in leadership, but even the trainings that you are conducting to build their capacity are happening at times when they are engaged in the domestic arena. So you will not have success. That is what makes the dimension of gender roles, time and space very important. And more so, even the legal rights and power and decision-making, those also are dimensions that are very important. And you can give me the next slide so that, yes, these are the details of the dimensions that I have shared. You can give me the next slide to save some time for discussion. Knowledge and culture, we have looked at them. Continue, please. Yes, now I want to share with you some tips in how you are going to be integrating gender as a researcher. Even at the point when you are conducting your literature review, to inform how you are conceptualizing your studies, gender is very important. And also, again, the concepts that we have looked at, the gender analysis, that should be done to consider what levels of interaction, what levels of knowledge are already with us, and what possibly remains to be established. When we integrate gender, even in our literature review, then we are going to be able to work with information that is going to address the needs and the priorities of the different categories of people that we are working with. The other stage that you need to look at is in how we are going to disaggregate our data, our findings. Who is giving you the information? Who are you inviting to participate in the research, in the studies, in the innovation, the co-creation? We need to always disaggregate and avoid the easy way out where we only report as researchers about the findings as if these findings are from nowhere. Whenever we have findings, they are certainly from somewhere. They're either given by female participants, possibly participants that have been excluded for a very long time, the marginalized, the indigenous community. So we need to disaggregate our findings for ease of implementing strategies that address the gaps that are making it very difficult to attain equality in our communities and also development. Another very important tip is the way we constitute the research teams. Time and again, women or those that are upcoming researchers are left out. Once this happens, then we will not be embracing integration of gender in our research terms. For that to ensure that we have gender integrated, even in the research teams, we have to ensure that everybody who is competent enough to serve as a research team member is integrated, and is equitably participating, not only at the lower levels, but even the senior researchers should ensure that they encourage the upcoming researchers, male and female, to participate so that the teams can grow and there's a multiplier effect. We also need to have mentorship in the research teams so that those that have already learned the science of how to conduct research that is gender sensitive are able to pass on the skill to the young researchers, and also ensure that we have teams that are competent enough to handle the task of integrating gender. It should not be left to one discipline, but all disciplines. That's why we usually promote multidisciplinary teams, so that there is learning from the different disciplines that happens, so that eventually we'll stop the need to have a gender specialist on research teams, because everybody will have picked the skills of integrating gender in our research. There are sometimes areas that are very easy to work with when we talk about integrating gender, because gender has been an issue of integration for a very long time. For example, it is now very easy to integrate gender in education. When we talk about access to education, when we talk about retention and performance, it is very easy to do a gender integration or a gender analysis of how these issues are faring out for male and female learners. But there are some areas of research that are not very easy to integrate gender. For example, if you talk about water, the water sector, it is not very easy for some researchers to see how you can integrate water in a research project, because water is water, but then it still has an area, a point of entry, integrating gender. For example, water is for us, the humans. And what do we use the water for? We can go back to our gender roles. When the women are using water for the homesteads, for the households, for the domestic arena, possibly the men are using it for the reproductive space, for the productive space, for income generating activities. And therefore the quality, the quantity, and the time of needing that water has a gender component in it. So such are the areas that you researchers need to look out for, whatever it is, be it innovations in maybe the computer world. You should always remember that gender is to improve the way we interact, the way we relate as males, male and female, so that opportunities can come to us equitably and the benefits can come to all of us equitably without leaving anyone disadvantaged. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, I have come to the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth. And over to you, Susie. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. Welcome, everyone. I recognize we are coming up on time here shortly. So if anyone has to drop off, let you know, we're going to let you know that we'll take some questions and things, and we can share that out since we are running a little bit over. But I'm going to jump into the financial and administrative aspects of pre-award and touch a little bit of compliance that's going to be needed during post-award as well, just because those you need to be aware during the pre-award process of what to expect. So the first thing that we have is really recognizing the type of awards that USAID provides. They do this in the form of acquisitions and assistance. Contracts fall under the acquisitions area, and then assistance, you have your grants and cooperative agreements. And depending on the type of award, this is where you'll get the level of involvement from USAID. So for this purpose, for the Laser Pulse Award, we really focus on the pre-award steps for cooperative agreements because that's what it is. You're seeing more and more of that, but you'll have contracts for various things. The contracts, there's a high level of control over those. You're really tied to specifics, whereas the Cooperative agreements, you're working with USAID frequently. So you could have weekly meetings with them. There should be, could be co-creation. We're seeing a lot of co-creation now in the pre-award steps. And then also there's opportunity for grants, which is limited oversight. It's a specific amount of money that goes towards specific activities, but there's not as much oversight or involvement as what you would see in a cooperative agreement. For this purpose, we're going to focus on that, and then we'll kind of go through the pre-award steps if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide. So part of the pre-award process, depending on the experience of your organization, you'll be required to fill out a pre-award institutional survey. This could be to a prime organization who's applying, or it could be if you are receiving direct to USAID, they may require this based on your past performance and performance history, or just the newness of your organization. Some of those things could include like your organizational structure, different policies and procedures, all of your internal controls. You would need to provide like audit findings, what types of programs and systems and software that you would use, different practices, even your payroll policies, your fringe benefit policies. You need to get into that detail with those, that survey. Next slide, please. Once you've kind of identified these solicitations and opportunities that are out there, and you do this pre-award survey, you also have to do some pre-award assurances. There's some standard form that's linked here, the 424B, but there's several different possibilities that you might have to complete. This has a lot of different requirements within this form, but there are other forms based on the type of agreement. So what you would need to do is just go through your solicitation, the notice of funding opportunity, whether it be from grants.gov or sam.gov, and find out what assurances are needed for that solicitation. And it could be that you're providing this to the prime sponsor, or you're providing it to the funding agency. And basically what they're doing with that assurance is making sure that you can complete the activities. Okay, next slide, please. Once you've provided all this detail, then USAID might find your application appealing. And so you would go through and negotiate program details to make sure it aligns with USAID's priorities. So there could be different changes that they might want you to make. It could be budget changes, scope changes, just to make sure that it is what they would like to see. It's the target audience that they would like to have included in the project, that you're going to meet the time frame that they need. And so you'll go through that negotiation. There's also some other pre-award activities that you would do. And basically part of the cooperative agreement, you would have approval of implementation plans. So a lot of times you'll have a specific time frame. Either it needs to be done at proposal, or you would have a time frame after you would be awarded that you would need to provide that implementation plan. Then the same thing with the monitoring and evaluation plan. Typically, we see a certain amount of time that you would need to provide the actual detailed, fully approved plan within a certain amount of days upon execution of award. Some of the other pre-award things, there could be key personnel specified. And usually in the solicitation, it would identify what those positions are and the requirements that they need to have in order to be successful in those positions. And those positions are usually mandatory in larger solicitations. So you just need to go through that and make sure what could be included in that solicitation to know that you're addressing all of the needs. Some of the other things that could be in there are sub-agreements for subrecipients. If you are completing a proposal application, if you're identifying those subrecipients ahead of time, you need to make sure that they are also capable of performing their work and scope, that you're providing the information to be able to get the approvals at that time of the award to enter into agreements with them. If you do that now, you don't have to worry about that after the award, because then you already have the approval with the award. And we'll talk later about if you need to add someone after the award's been executed. And then there's just other standard terms that you might have you want to make sure of if there's any reasons why that you would need to halt construction. Be aware that USAID can add some language into those. So then once you have all that solicitation and information, put your proposal in an application, there would be a final review and then an award decision. So this could come from USAID directly, or it could come from a prime institution who has a larger agreement that is doing different application rounds, such as Laser. Laser's done that, several rounds that we've had to where we would work with you on your applications and things prior to putting it forward to USAID for that final approval. So we're going to take a look at that and make sure that the budget is in line, that the activities are in line with USAID's priorities, and then make sure that it's ready for USAID's review and approval. Once we have USAID's approval, then we would basically notify the successful organization, or USAID would notify the successful organization. And then a final version of that is usually sent for signature. So we, as Laser Pulse, have been getting approval from USAID, and then we'll enter into an agreement with the teams that were successful. If USAID is providing that, they would enter the final version of the agreement that would be then reviewed to be signed and executed. So some of the things that might be included in that is like the award letter. You'll have your scope of work, so your program description or proposal information, your budget, the time frame, schedule of deliverables, and then any provisions that might be applicable to the award. So once you get this award, you need to start planning, implementing, and reporting. So some of the first things that you need to do is make sure if there's any procurement that needs to be done, you start to initiate that. Branding and marking is a big one where usually it depends. It's either pre-award, or a lot of times you'll see that you need to have that within a certain amount of time after the award's been executed. Then you'll have to identify your reporting timelines, whether that's programmatic or financial, or any other compliance. There's several different types of reports that you might have. And then you also need to be aware of any kind of audit requirements and record keeping requirements. For record keeping, just be aware, like, you have to keep those records for at least 3 years after the close of the project. A lot of people might do 7 to 10 years, which would typically cover a lot of projects. But let's say you had a 5-year program that got a 5-year extension. You're already at 10 years. You still need to keep it another 3 years. So you always need to make sure that you keep those records on hand for at least 3 years after the closeout of the award. So once you have the award with USAID and you're starting to implement, you're starting to do these things, you need to get the agreements with your partners established. So all of those partners that you decided to work with at your pre-award stage, now that you have a fully executed agreement, you need to go through and get them set up as well. So you'll start to set your systems up, but at the same time, you need to then issue agreements to your subrecipients to make sure that they're using the appropriate terms, conditions. They have scope, budget, and everything. This could be through a contract or an MOU. There's different mechanisms that you can use for this particular purpose. And then we are going to get it ready to get into some of the compliance items that we also need to make sure happen, whether it's pre-award, post-award, all combined. Some of these things happen in both areas. So you're going to want to make sure any of the provisions are included in any of those subrecipient agreements, because they're going to be subject to the terms and conditions of the overall sponsor cooperative agreement. So you need to make sure that those terms are passed down to each of the subrecipients. And some of those things could be the reporting timelines, to make sure that you have the information to be able to complete your own financial reports or your own programmatic reports. You also would need to make sure that any of the, letting them know any of the records should be available, or helping to track the budget performance for the sub-agreements. Just making sure that they have all the same terms and conditions that you would have in that agreement. Each of that needs to flow down. As you get your agreement, another thing to look for is prior approvals. So your agreement typically would specify when you would need to seek prior approval and when you would not. So one example, a larger example, is if you have an approved budget, you are typically provided a little bit of a tolerance for any kind of budget changes. It depends on the sponsor, it depends on the type of award, and it depends on the award itself. So the operating unit could provide you with a variance of, let's say, 10%. So basically, if you are going to shift items from a salary item to a travel item, as long as you do not shift more than 10% of the total award, then you don't need to seek prior approval. But if you're going to exceed 10%, then you would need to seek that. So let's say you ended up having a vacancy in your personnel line and you needed to hire a consultant for a while, and that cost ended up being more than 10% of your award. You would have to get an approval on that because a consultant would end up being on your other direct cost category instead of your personnel line. So that's where you would need to seek that prior approval. Another example of this is any scope change or objective of the program, participant support costs. Participant support costs, any kind of transfer of funds to and from that needs to have approval. And that's usually tied into like IRB type questions or workshop trainees, things like that, that might trigger other questions. Any sub-awards that you did not identify in your pre-award stage, those would also require an approval as well. And you would go through the same steps in doing that sub-award approval and collecting the information, making sure that you have the scope for that sub-award, making sure you have the budget. USAID would need all of those details to be able to provide that approval to you. There's also restricted commodities that you would want to make sure to have prior approval on, and we'll touch on those a little bit later as well. So the next one listed here is SAM.gov registration. So this is key for both pre and post award. So your pre-award steps, if you are going to receive funding directly from the US government, you are required to have a SAM.gov registration. If you are only going to be a sub-award with sub-recipient reporting requirements only, then you would just need to have a unique entity identifier. But both of those processes can take several weeks. There's a little bit of a backlog right now, but part of it is just the time that it takes to get those entity validations. It can be lengthy, and there could be a lot of different activities you need to do in order to have that go through without issues. So like if you are an organization trying to get your registration or trying to even just get a unique entity identifier, if you're located internationally, you need to make sure that all documents that you have on the required list of documents are in both the language that it's in plus the US language. So you could have up to 6 documents that you're including to get that registration. There are a ton of tips. There are a ton of videos. It is a process to go through some of these steps, but USAID, the federal government, they have provided a lot of good resources that as you're walking through this, you can definitely, it is possible for everyone to do. And there's usually someone who is willing to help to get this done for you. Another compliance item is the host government tax. It's kind of perfect timing right now because we're in the middle of collecting all of our host government tax from all of our subrecipients to prepare our final report, or not final report, but prepare our annual report. So each year in April, the subrecipient and recipient must report information that has specific quantities where you would pay, I believe it's $500 or more for specific commodities. If you paid that and paid a VAT tax, or you had custom duties, and then you basically collect all that information and then you would report on everything from subrecipients, everything from you, and you typically do that within by April 16th of each year, but it would also specify any other dates within your agreement. And all of the details are usually specified within your agreement. Next slide, please. Travel guidelines, there's a few here. I'm not going to go through in too much detail here because we're running out of time a little bit, but make sure that you know whether or not international travel is approved in your agreement, or if you need prior approval for that. Most things you need to do the Fly America Act restrictions. Some of those Fly America Act, there could be exceptions depending on the situation, but you need to make sure and document that. Any airfare should be like lowest standard cost. Any exceptions should be documented. Go to the next slide. The exceptions I mentioned to the Fly America Act are included here. You can also find those on the government websites as well. Most things should be the US government rates or your institutional policies, depending on what those are. There's mileage rates here, a lot of different good links for you. So please check those out if you need some information on that. Next slide, please. And again, I talked earlier about the restricted commodities. Some of those are listed here, but one of the ones I wanted to bring up was like the pesticides. So there's a reason why these are restricted. It triggers some of the environmental things. So if you are doing this, you need to make sure that you're checking all the restricted commodities that there might be. It's usually listed in your awards, but it's also in like the Code of Federal Regulations. Next slide, please. And as a part of the Section 889, Chinese telecommunication restrictions, you just need to be aware there are certain companies you cannot buy telecommunications equipment from with US government funding. There's a link here that gives you the details, but just to bring your awareness to that, make sure that you're adhering to it. And then you also have some ineligible commodities, suppliers, services, like your surveillance equipment, luxury goods, weather modification, any kind of debarred organizations or other organizations that might be tripped on some of the sanctioned lists. Go ahead. Some of your unallowable costs that go right along with your ineligible commodities, like these are not allowable. You need to be aware of that. If you put a proposal in with these items, it's going to get denied because you can't have some of these costs on there. And then financial reporting, you got to make sure that you adhere to the PreAward agreement for what your reporting requirements are. The SF425 is pretty common, and it's usually quarterly, sometimes semi-annual, sometimes monthly. And so you would go to your agreement, and then you would also have specific requirements in place for each of your subrecipients based on what you need to have. And then for auditing purposes, you need to make sure that you're aware of any audit considerations. There's a link here that you can kind of look into, but making sure that you are able to provide the details for those audits. And also there could be additional other reports that might be as needed. You could have projection needs, you could have pipeline needs, any other things that might be required. And then we have trafficking in persons. This is usually specified in your agreement, but any activity over $500,000 happening international would be subject to this. So some of these items are listed here. I won't go through the list, but you just have to certify, and usually you certify each year. It's usually in the proposal, it's in the solicitation, in your assurances and certifications. You do an annual certification that none of your employees or vendors or consultants are engaging in any form of trafficking in persons. Next slide. And then just for your reference as we wrap up, and I apologize for rushing through a little bit of this, I know we're out of time, but some of these key references here you could link to, and then also just look at your agreement, look at your award, look at the solicitation, look at your proposal. Like, there could be key provisions that you need to make sure you follow. It could be different federal regulations that you need to adhere to. Standard with USAID a lot of times is the 2 CFR 200 or ADS 303. So make sure of what your organization is, what is applicable to you, and then you will be able to have all the information handy to be able to make sure that you're compliant and you're putting forth the best proposal that you can based on those terms and conditions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you, Betty. Looking through the chat room, maybe before we look through the chat room, allow me to also thank our participants who have stayed with us beyond the top of the hour. Thank you so much. We are going to conclude this in the next few minutes. So looking through the chat room, we had just one question for Ruth, and she is engaging about that question. But Ruth, I think the participant is asking, can you recommend any relevant tool? As per the question, he would love for you to recommend any relevant tool in addition to what he shared within the chat room. Ruth, are you able to respond to that real quick before we conclude?
Yes, thank you, Harriet, and thank you, Gaten. I can't pronounce that name. I do not want to do a disservice to the name, the pronunciation. And usually the question that has been asked is about women not responding positively to invitations for opportunities. There is a tool that we can use, a beneficiaries assessment tool, where we can be able as researchers to know who is benefiting from this innovation or product that we have put out, and why they possibly are not benefiting, or the factors that are influencing the benefit or the non-benefit. And this can be used during data collection. It can be used during monitoring and evaluation. It can also be used during the end line assessment for effective completion of the projects. I hope that is useful. And there are many other tools that we can use, but this one I have found very useful. I thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And we wanted to bring this to a close in the next few minutes, but maybe before we do, from our participants, do we have any one person who give one chance who has something to ask, feedback, or input into what has been shared? Do we have any? I don't see any hands up. Do we have anyone? Mohammed Amin. Mohammed Amin, over
yes,
to you.
I really thank you very much for participants as well as organizers. I am representing 6 Somali Institute for Development Studies, and I really appreciate it. It was very informative. Session was very good, but I had a question, which is, if I understood well, one of the main slide has been written as MOU's been the main recipient of USAID assistance, as well as and subcontractors will be subjected to monitoring and investigation by the USAID. Is that correct, or am I understood wrongly?
I could jump in and answer that. Yes, that is correct. All the terms would be applicable to whether it was a recipient or a contractor, and it would all be subject to audit and monitoring. Typically with a subrecipient, they would get their questions filtered through the prime organization. So you may not be dealing with USAID directly on some of the monitoring. It just depends on the situation. But most of the time, like all the terms would be applicable unless there was a specific reason why a deviation needed to be made. But everything would be subject to both the recipient and subcontractor.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susie, and thank you, Mohammed. We would love to bring this to a close, unless one individual has a very itching thing, and we'll give less than a minute. Going once, twice. Okay, so we will bring this to a close by thanking our presenters. Thank you so much, Betty, Ruth, and Susie. But we also want to thank the Laser Pulse Consortium as a whole for working closely with Makerere University to come up with this toolkit, but also to share it. I have posted in the chat room my email address, just in case you have really quick questions in regards to the toolkit that I can then forward to our presenters. Then please feel free to share it. Like my colleague Chris earlier shared, we will share the recording, but also we'll share with you the slides. Once again, thank you so much for joining this engagement, and thank you for being a part of the journey that the Laser Pulse Consortium is taking. Would like to bring this to a close, and bye for now. Yes, we will share the toolkit. Thank you, Kusi. And thank you all participants. Have a